Greetings all, in today's video we're going to have a build of the 1/72nd scale easy assembly Hobby Boss FM-1 Wildcat, and we're going to see how we go hand painting with Vallejos Model Air airbrush range. To begin with, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the moulding process, and then I began to cut out the parts from the sprue. The fuselage comes moulded as one piece, however there was a nasty ejector pin mark on the inside which I had to pry out using my sprue cutters. Once I'd done that, I cleaned up the edges of the wings using both the sprue cutters to remove excess sprue and a file to remove some of the seam lines before I then glued the top of the wings to the bottom of the fuselage. The wings fitted pretty nicely in after they'd been cleaned up and there wasn't really too much of a gap. I did have to put a fair bit of pressure though before the parts would fit. I then put into place the bulkhead that the engine attaches to and then spent a bit of time removing the seam line on the fuselage. Because of the way the fuselage is moulded, there is a fair bit of a seam line. I first used a file and then started to use some finer sandpaper to get it nice and smooth. With the seam line gone, I then glued into place the two horizontal stabilizers. The fit of the stabilizers to the fuselage is nice and tight, and they're also keyed so you can't put them in the wrong way. I then assembled the landing gear, which consists of a part containing the struts and a second one with some extra detailing and the landing gear flaps. They fitted quite nicely together and all things considered were nicely detailed. There's a few extra parts for the interior, including a headrest for the pilot, a joystick and also a basic gun sight. I removed the wheels from the sprue and sanded one edge of them down slightly to give them the illusion of being slightly weighted, and then I glued them onto the landing gear struts. They fitted quite nicely and overall the landing gear has some nice details and is pretty solid. I then cut out the clear part for the underside of the aircraft and carefully removed the excess flash that was blocking the area where the propeller shaft goes. I usually leave smaller accessories that are likely to get damaged off the model, but the pitot tube was quite a solid looking thing, so I glued it onto the wing. Now the last thing that was needed before the aircraft could be painted was to fill in some of the very small gaps where the wings and the fuselage parts met using a bit of Vallejos water-based putty applied with a cocktail stick, and if required I would remove the excess with a damp finger. After leaving the putty overnight to dry, I begin to paint the interior of the aircraft using XF71 cockpit green for the cockpit and the lower part of the floor, and a little bit of Vallejo yellow-green 954 in the engine cowling to get more of a zinc yellow chromat effect. At this stage I also cut out a little bit of thin wire and bend it to shape with some tweezers, and then use a bit of Deluxe Materials Rocket CA glue to glue some of the wiring into the landing gear to just give it a bit more detail. I also carefully paint the canopy frames with a fine brush, XF71 cockpit green, for both the underside windows and the main cockpit canopy. One of the advantages of using the water-based acrylics on the clear parts is that you can easily scratch the excess off after it is dried to help neaten up any mistakes and make sure you have nice and thin canopy frame. After one more coat for the inside of the aircraft and the interior of the cowling in both their respective colours, I get out some Vallejo flat black and paint the instrument panel and some of the details in the cockpit, and a bit of XF16 flat aluminium to start painting the engine details. At this stage I used the first of the Model Air colours, which in this case was light gull grey, to paint the interior of the landing gear bay. While the first coat dried, I cleaned up the canopy frame since it was now dry, and I also painted the centre of the engine XF24 dark grey. I did 2 coats of the dark grey for the engine, and then did a second coat of light gull grey for the inside of the landing gear, and then I did some final touch-ups with the flat black on the pilot's headrest and the propeller blades before it was time to paint the main camouflage. There were 2 marking options included in this kit, one for an aircraft from VC33 in the standard navy 3-tone blue camouflage with the roundel with the red markings from 1943, and another one from VC12 which was in the 2-tone light grey camouflage used in the Atlantic Theatre. I thought it was cool that they included the grey scheme option for the Wildcat, but I decided instead, because I wanted to try out the 3 blue colours, to go with VC33's aircraft, which was S31. You can find a few good pictures of this plane as well, since it was involved in a training video which was filmed on the USS Nassau. For the first colour I start with the lightest, which is Insignia White number 279. I apply it onto the brush by squeezing it directly out of the bottle, and then I begin to paint it onto the model. I use my normal technique of brush painting, which is to apply it onto the aircraft in the same direction as much as possible to reduce brush strokes, usually from the front to the rear. I used the same technique but with a finer brush for the underside windows to paint around the frames, and then I start with the lightest coat on the upper surface, which in this case was intermediate blue number 299. I apply this in exactly the same fashion as the white, going from the front of the aircraft to the rear as much as possible, and then I apply a second coat of white followed by a second coat of intermediate blue. I found overall the consistency of the paints was really quite nice, and they were very good and thin, which makes sense being airbrush paints. They'd have a pretty quick drying time, as most acrylics water-based do, and you can thin them down with a little bit of water, although I found I didn't have to do this very regularly. I also found it was a bit easier to pour a little bit out of the pot onto a piece of cardboard and use that as a palette rather than putting it on the brush, since it meant you could give it a little bit more of a stir to make it nice and uniform. I then set the model aside for the second coats of paint to dry, and in the meantime started to paint the canopy frame with the darker colour, which is USN Sea Blue number 295. I got out a larger brush and applied it also on the upper surfaces of the wing and fuselage, and also along a narrow stretch that runs from the midsection of the aircraft towards the tail based on the instructions. I had to paint it a little bit more carefully at this stage to try and make sure I didn't get any overlap between the blue, although because these paints are so thin, their transparent nature doesn't really go away until they've had two coats, so it's pretty easy to neaten up any mistakes you make with the colour underneath. I did two coats of the navy sea blue, and then started to do another coat of white to help neaten up any mistakes, followed by a coat of intermediate blue. For each colour I'd end up doing about 5 or 6 layers of them. This is largely because, as I mentioned, the paint is very transparent, so it needs a few layers to build up before it becomes uniform. Honestly, I find this a really good thing, especially for brush painting, because it means you end up with some very nice and thin layers of paint which don't hide details, and because you do so many it becomes nice and smooth and you don't see as many brush strokes. In between painting the coats, I do some finer details such as using flat black to paint the rubber on the tyres, and also the glare shield for the pilot's instrument panel, which I accidentally painted over while doing the main camouflage, and also some extra details on the landing gear bay. I also used some XF16 flat aluminium to paint some of the landing gear struts, and a bit of Vallejo flat yellow to paint the tips of the propeller blade. The final coats of US Navy Sea Blue and also Intermediate Blue were applied, and I was happy with how they looked, so I could finally move on to decals. Fortunately, the drying time for the paints was around about 10 minutes, so it didn't take me too long, although it obviously did take a lot longer than if I'd just done 3 coats as I normally would. To apply the decals, I used my normal technique of cutting out the ones I want using a pair of scissors and sticking them in a little bit of slightly warmed up water. After the decals start to come loose of the transfer paper, I then use a brush to gently brush them off, and then I slide them onto the area I want them on the model. I sometimes use a paper towel to damp away some of the excess water if there's a little bit too much. There weren't too many common stencils, it was only really the main markings included, but that was okay. I don't think the Wildcats had too many extra markings on them. Overall, the decals went on very easily and the quality of them was really quite good, although I did find they had a tendency to fold if you weren't very careful. Once all the decals have been applied, I then get out some Vallejo decal softener and put it on a damp cotton tip, and then rub it onto the decals to help soften them so that they can form to details more easily. I finally apply some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them and then dab away the excess with a paper towel. The adhesive just helps it stick a little bit more to the model, as the name suggests, and combined with the decal softener helps them sink into all the fine details, giving them a painted on effect. I then give the model a full 24 hours for the decals to dry before moving on to the weathering process. As usual, I start with some metal chipping, first by getting some XF16 flat aluminium and a very fine brush, and after making sure there's a bit of a flat aluminium on the brush but it's not too wet so it won't flow, I very gently stipple it along the areas where I want to create metal chipping, gradually increasing how much there is until I'm happy with the effect. I focus the metal chipping on areas such as the access hatches and areas where the maintenance crew would regularly open up and perform maintenance and possibly scratch the paint, on areas exposed to the airflow which could cause some of the paint to wear off, such as the leading edges of the wing and around the front of the cowling, on moving parts such as around the landing gear, the control surfaces and the wing folding area, and also a bit where the crew would walk and could possibly scratch the paint off as they get in and out of the aircraft. At this stage I also decided to fix up the fact that the aircraft has an extra machine gun which was not present on the FM-1 Wildcat, So I did this by cutting off the extra bulge for the machine gun and using a bit of putty to fill in the gaps where the guns are. I also decided to glue on some bits of spare clear sprue to create the exhausts, since these were not moulded into the engine cowling. I painted the black anti-slipping area over the top of the metal chipping to get a bit more of a realistic and layered effect, and then moved on to adding a little bit more chipping around the edges of it, the canopy frame, and also on the propeller blades. I decided to do some further experimenting with the metal chipping by trying to recreate the yellow primer chips that are very often seen on US Navy aircraft from World War II. To do this, I used some XF71 cockpit green and dabbed a little bit around the areas where I'd previously done the metal chipping using a fine brush and trying to keep it so that the cockpit green was dry when it was applied so that it wouldn't flow and create soft edges. Although I probably should have used the yellow green since this is a closer match, there was a bit of variation with the primer used by these aircraft, so it seems like it was still appropriate to use this more green colour. To tone down the chipping effect, which in my opinion was a little bit too strong, I decided to add some of the base camouflage colours over the top, which also added a bit of a illusion of layering so it looked more like the paint had been stripped away rather than I had added the metal chipping and the green primer over the top of the paint. I also experimented by applying a little bit of the base colours on the decals to try and create some chips on them in certain areas, but I didn't really like the effect. Fortunately though, the US Navy's sea blue matched perfectly with the roundels, so I could patch up any of the chipping I did that I did not like. Next I got out some Tamiya panel liner scent black and applied it heavily onto the propeller and engines, and then started to apply it on the rest of the airframe. At first I focused it on some of the axis areas that I wanted to create some extra grease effects, but in the end, based on looking at reference photos, I decided to do a relatively light coat over the entire model, focusing a little bit more panel on some of the areas such as the control surfaces and around the engine to help build up a layer of grime. As well as doing this, it also helped to create a post-shading effect and highlight some of the panel lines which were a little bit more dull now that I'd applied some of the darker colours. Since the paint of the aircraft was done with acrylics, I could use enamel thinners to remove the excess panel wash. I did this by using a cotton tip and rubbing it in a bit of the X20 thinner, and then rubbing along the areas where I wanted to remove it. I kept a fair bit around the engine and tried to make it look like it was streaking backwards to create the effect of oil leaks over time, since radial engines do have a tendency to leak oil. I found that by using the cotton tip to remove the excess panel liner from the middle of some panels, and taking care not to remove it from the recesses, you can create a very nice post-shading effect which gives the impression that the paint is a little bit worn out and the aircraft is quite weathered. I repeated the same process on the underside of the aircraft, taking care to leave some extra grime in the areas where the control surfaces were, and using the post-shading technique on some of the larger panels. Once this was done, I decided to give a little bit of attention to the very basic cockpit. There's no decal provided for the instrument panel, so I decided to paint on some instrument dials using some flat white and vermilion red. I also neatened up the seat cushion and gave the interior a panel wash. The final step for weathering was to use some of the Tamiya weathering powders to create some extra effects. I used black to create some oil leaks coming out of the engine cowling, and also to create some grease effects around the control surfaces and where the gun smoke was. To do this, I would apply it using a fine brush, using a bit of water if I wanted to thicken the colour, and then I'd rub away the excess using my finger. You can also dampen your finger or use a brush to help wipe away the excess. I find though that once they're dried they're pretty solid, even though they are water-based weathering powders which can get rubbed off quite easily as they're drying. In addition to the black, I also use a little bit of the rust colour on the underside and some of the metal chipped areas to create a bit of an illusion of perhaps a little bit of rust or other kinds of dirt and grease building up over time. I decided to experiment with using some of the Tamiya flat clear on this model to make the decals a little bit more matte and help blend everything together, so I removed all the clear parts which I hadn't glued in place and gave the aircraft 2 coats of Tamiya flat clear. Once this was done, I then placed the clear parts back onto the model, and with that, the Hobby Boss 1/72nd scale FM-1 Wildcat was finally completed. And here you can see the final result, and I have to say I'm really pleased with how this model went together, and I'm quite happy with what I managed to get in the end out of it. It's a pretty simple kit, it didn't take me much more than about 20 minutes to put together, and although the details are a little bit simplified, what you do get is still quite nice. It's definitely not as detailed as the Airfix Wildcat, and it's also missing a lot of the options such as the pilot, the extra decals, and also the wing folding mechanisms. But if you're a beginner or just want a nice cheap Wildcat to experiment with, then this is a fantastic kit. It's about half the price of the Airfix one, and so for what I was doing with this aircraft, which was messing around with some different paints and trying some different weathering techniques, it was absolutely fantastic. And speaking of painting, I have to say I think I really liked using the Model Air colours to hand paint with. I know that a lot of people are going to be screaming at me, go buy an airbrush, it looks like a child painted it, but in my opinion it looks pretty decent, and I think the Model Air colours still do a really good job with hand painting. Because they're so thin, it's pretty easy to apply several layers without having too much of an issue with it, and you don't have to thin them down very much out of the bottle, so that's pretty fantastic. In the end, I think the result was pretty good that I got with them. Maybe I could have done a few less coats, or maybe thinned them a little bit more and reduced even more of the brush strokes, but I think it's pretty decent and definitely a step up from a lot of the Tamiya paints. I was really happy with how my weathering turned out as well, although I have to say I'm not super happy with how the flat clear went. I think it dulled the model down a little bit too much, and although it was nice because it made the decals blend in very easily, it also seemed to create a bit of a splotchy kind of texture on the aircraft, which was a bit weird, so maybe in the future I will experiment with hand painting a bit of matte varnish from Vallejo onto just the decals and see how it goes. But that's it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel to know when my next videos are coming out. Big thank you, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the products that I use. And also a little shout out to my local hobby shop, Tectonic Hobbies, the local store on the Sunshine Coast where you can buy this kit and of course many others. Thanks again, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.